Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the latest instalment of the Border 100 Symposium. I'm joined today by Leeann Lane, Dr. Leeann Lane from Dublin City University. Leann's written books about Rosamund Jacob and is currently working on a book about Mary McSweeney. But her middle book, shall we say, at the moment of our list was on Dorothy Macardle, who's a local figure of some significance in Louth and in Dundalk. And Leann is going to talk to us today about Dorothy Macardle's view of partition, part of another piece of research on Dorothy's life that she's done. So over to you, Leann.
Thank you very much, Tommy. I'm going to just share my screen now. Okay. Dorothy Macardle was one of Ireland's foremost female polemicists at a time when the Irish state worked to forge its political and cultural identity after 1922. Her peers within post-Civil War Sinn Féin and later Fianna Fáil, as well as those in the wider Irish political community, considered her an intellectually strong, politically persuasive and robust voice. Having published Tragedies of Kerry, in a pro-Republican account of the Civil War in that county in 1924, she was tasked by Eamon de Valera in 1925 with writing the history of the revolutionary period from his perspective. The result, The Irish Republic, was published to much acclaim, establishing Macardle as one of the key political propagandists of her era. The Irish Republic is not a text that immediately springs to mind in the context of debates on partition, and yet the anatomy of the creation of the border is woven through the polemic and is central to Macardle's examination of the revolutionary period. And this is the first focus of the paper. From the period of her Civil War imprisonment, she was imprisoned for 6 months, from early November until the end of May. From the period of her Civil War imprisonment, Macardle was centrally immersed in the changing discourse and debate as to what constituted an authentic Republican nation and how it could and should be achieved. Crucial to Macardle's concept of the Irish Republic was the elimination of what she believed to be and viewed as an artificial border. The Irish Republic emphasises Macardle's belief that the treaty delegates were manipulated by Lord George. Now, she does indict the 5 men as remiss in not telephoning to Dublin before acceptance of the Article of Agreement. The latter reproach, of course, must be viewed in the context of the Irish Republic as a work of propaganda in defence of the politics and decisions de Valera made, particularly during the treaty debates and the ensuing Civil War. Unlike the first night of the truce, she wrote, quote, "No bonfires were lit for this news," end quote, the news of the treaty. The Anglo-Irish Treaty, Macardle argued, quote, "not only made partition possible, but it prevented the wishes of the inhabitants from being the sole determining factor in delimiting boundaries," end quote. So this paper will also examine Macardle's treatment of the nationalist minority in Northern Ireland after the partition of Ireland under the Government of Ireland Act 1920. At various points in the Irish Republic, Macardle is concerned to draw the reader's attention to the plight of what she describes as Northern nationalists, but interestingly with little or no reference to the position of Southern Unionists. Partition, she wrote, resulted in the creation of, quote, "a frontier state in which nearly every adult male Orangeman had a gun," end quote. The manner in which Macardle modulated the extent and severity of Republican violence in the new Northern state, removing certain key events from her narrative, will also be discussed briefly. The notable example is the lack of any reference in the Irish Republic to the Otnavay massacre of June 1922. The tempering or elision of Republican violence in Northern Ireland was a narrative device, I would argue, to heighten and even manipulate the reader's sense of the oppression of Northern nationalists. Her accounts of the deaths of Northern nationalists in a number of cases are actually repurposed to include a home family element that did not exist in newspaper reports. Through the use of emotive language and a concern to show the effect of unionist violence on women and children, her reader is encouraged to engage on a visceral level with the manner in which partition resulted in, quote, "the terrible situation of Catholics in the 6 counties," end quote. Consequently, the Irish Republic provides a distorted and partisan account of the immediate consequences of, as she viewed it, the geographical and political dismemberment of the island of Ireland. Macardle dates the introduction of the move towards partition as a solution to the impasse created by Ulster Unionist opposition to the Third Home Rule Bill to 1913. In describing the events of that year, she repeatedly stresses the illegality of the latter position, the position of the Ulster Unionists. Every, quote, constitutional victory for the Home Rule Party was made the signal for the intensification of the unconstitutional activities of the Unionists, end quote. On the 24th of September 1913, Edward Carson and other leading Unionists proclaimed the establishment of a provisional government for Ulster in the event of the imposition of Home Rule on the province. Macardle highlighted that the Ulster Unionist Council had no democratic mandate in the form of an election and yet had, quote, resolved itself into the central authority of the provisional government of Ulster, end quote. Using the term loyalists in quotation marks, she amplifies for her reader the fact that at the very time a potential war with Germany was looming, Unionist men and women were not deterred, quote, from organising against the British government, end quote, making overtures even, she argued, to the Kaiser. Despite the actions of the Ulster Unionists in 1913 and beyond, Macardle first and foremost held Lord George responsible for the growing solidification of the concept of partition. Now, recent historians such as Conor Mulvey and M.C. Rast also argue for the centrality of the role of Lord George in the move to a two-state solution in this period. Rast states that, quote, it was during the 1916 negotiations that partition assumed its final form and Lord George was its primary author, end quote. In the Irish Republic, Macardle's account of Lord George's early manoeuvrings towards partition was arguably in large degree influenced by his role in the treaty talks of 1921. Repeatedly, she referred to his recourse to threat, notably the threat of a return to the violence of the War of Independence should the Irish delegates fail to sign the treaty. Lord George was a man she portrayed as wily, manipulative, and perfidious. It should be noted, of course, that modern historians have also described Lord George as acting disingenuously at various points in his negotiations with both the Irish Parliamentary Party and, after 1916, Sinn Féin. Moreover, Lord George was, as he put it himself in a private correspondence, quote, sympathetic to the claims of Ulster, end quote. The treaty delegates are represented by Macardle as unable to match his duplicity and consequently, quote, the partition clause remained in the agreement they brought back to Dublin. The Irish Republic is organised along chronological lines, with the time period of each chapter clearly delineated in the title. Beginning her discussion of 1914, Macardle sounded a note of ominous portent. That the year she described, that year, 1914, she declared that year she declared, quote, opened in an atmosphere heavy with the threat of civil war, end quote. Macardle, from this point in her narrative, charges Lord George with subversive political machinations facilitating the drift towards partition. Indeed, the latter, together with Winston Churchill, had, she wrote, proposed special accommodation for Ulster to the cabinet as early as February 1912. Partition, Macardle argued, was now a central trope of Britain's Irish policy. Crucially, she noted that this had implications for the nationalist minority in Ulster, and she said that the British government failed to, quote, check the illegal activities of the Ulster Volunteers. She wrote, there could be no doubt that to compromise with the Covenanteers, sacrifice the Northern Nationalists, and even, if Carson required it, to partition Ireland was the high policy of the government now. With the Ulster Volunteers armed by the end of April 1914, and of course the Irish Volunteers armed somewhat by July 1914, the government was facing the threat of violence when the royal assent to the Home Rule Bill was granted. In this context, Asquith proposed to introduce an amending bill. In Macardle's chronicle, it was Lord George and not Asquith whom she charges with having, quote, revealed the fact that the amending bill was to embody proposals to exclude a part of Ireland from the operation of Home Rule, end quote. Redmond's vote for the government is noted, but there is no direct criticism of his actions. Instead, Macardle focuses on the response of the people to the passing of the Home Rule Bill, with a quotation from William O'Brien, who described the lighting of bonfires by Nationalist Ireland, quote, without the slightest suspicion that they were all the time celebrating their own condonation of partition, end quote. The threat of partition, Macardle argues, galvanised all shades of nationalist opinion in Ireland. It was an issue, she wrote, which united the All for Ireland League, Sinn Féin, Irish Labour, and the most uncompromising separatists, while Irish volunteer cohesion increased. However, she also presented the impotence of nationalist Ireland in the face of the threat. Despite the fact that partition was, quote, unthinkable, end quote, they had no mechanism, quote, to avert it, unless possibly by the force of arms, end quote. Following the 1916 rebellion, Asquith appointed Lord George to find a settlement to the Irish question that would satisfy both Unionists and Nationalists who were represented by the Irish Parliamentary Party. With a full grasp of the manner in which events on the world stage, notably the context of the First World War and Britain's need for America to enter the conflict to relieve its growing manpower crisis within the armed forces. She fully understands this wider conflict, and she said that Lord George needed, quote, to get something done in Ireland, even provisionally, to mitigate against the effect produced by the executions on public feeling in the United States. To that end, he proposed partition, she wrote, as a solution, despite, as she argued, the concept having been repudiated by both sides at the Buckingham Palace Conference in July 1914 as, quote, impractical and unsatisfactory, end quote. That conference, the Buckingham Palace Conference, convened to delineate and clarify the proposed area for exclusion, ended, she wrote, quote, in failure on July 24th. In Macardle's narrative, Lord George was not to be deterred. He had pledged himself to Home Rule, she wrote, and would lose prestige, if not office, by its defeat, end quote. His partisan approach was, according to Macardle, contained in a private covering letter sent to Sir Edward Carson on the 29th of May 1916. That same communication contained, quote, certain heads for a bill as to the Government of Ireland, end quote, proposing the application of the Home Rule Act 1914 to the 26 southern counties and the exclusion of Antrim, Down, Armagh, Derry, Fermanagh and Tyrone from its remit. Despite the apparent vagueness of the bill as to whether partition would be temporary or permanent, Macardle quotes Carson. The letter he received, he said, was a, quote, precious possession, his words, guaranteeing that at the end of the provisional period under the bill, quote, the 6 counties would be left out and they could never be put back again without an act of Parliament. She's quoting Carson there. While in the words of William O'Brien, that, quote, particular partition plot is dead and damned, it became, according to the narrative of the Irish Republic, the, quote, indisputable Magna Carta of Sir Edward Carson's 6 counties, end quote. Moreover, Macardle wrote, the scheme had served the intentions of its architect, Lord George, quote, it had satisfied America that an effort at an Irish settlement was being made, end quote. To emphasise the iniquity of the British government, Macardle closes that chapter with an emotive reminder to the reader that as partition was solidifying as a political solution to the Ulster question, the 1916 executions had not yet concluded. The reader is evocatively reminded that, quote, at the Old Bailey in London on June 26th, the trial of Roger Casement began, end quote. The Irish Republic ascribes to what FSL Lyons has described as the, quote, oft-told tale, end quote, of the transformation of public opinion after the 1916 executions towards support for Sinn Féin, resulting in the whole-scale defeat of the Irish Parliamentary Party in the 1918 general election. However, despite the romantic narrative which is present in Macardle's text, she talks about the awakening of the Irish people to the shame and impotence of their position under British rule. Despite this romantic narrative, her analysis is more politically specific on close reading. She represents the issue of partition as one which was central to the by-elections of 1917 and 1918. The South Longford by-election on the 9th of May 1917 was contested by Paddy McKenna for the Irish Parliamentary Party, and this man here, Joseph McGuinness, for Sinn Féin. He was actually in Louth prison during the election, hence the poster put him in to get him out, put him into Parliament to get him out of jail. Macardle represented the issue of partition as, quote, inextricably bound up with the conflict between the parliamentary party, which had once consented to it, and the whole body of opinion that went by the name Sinn Féin, end quote. The issue of the potential dismemberment of the country was, according to Macardle's construction of events, a crucial hinge on which success for McGuinness was achieved by the narrow margin of 37 votes. Quote, for many who would not otherwise have found the courage for the great hazard of a Republican struggle, the dread of partition turned scale. Macardle continued to emphasise the manner in which partition was core to the British government's position on Ireland as the Irish Republic moves into the later revolutionary period. As the War of Independence waged, Lloyd George, she declared, quote, was pursuing a patient and politic course, end quote. The latter was Prime Minister since December 1916, and crucial to his political strategy, according to Macardle, was partition. Quote, clearly he had made up his mind that the solution of the Irish question lay in partition. With 6 counties secured for the Empire as a garrison, the resistance of the 26 counties could more easily be worn down. Even though it might become necessary to give these a measure of self-government, Ireland partitioned would be unable to achieve a position of prosperity or influence. To reduce the Irish people to a condition in which they would be ready to consent to partition and renounce the Republic was the task entrusted to the administration in Dublin Castle. Macardle emphasised the manner in which all Irish nationalists of all hues, were removed from the decision-making process as a border increasingly became an inevitability. Her use of juxtaposition should be noted in this discussion. The third reading of what she describes as the Partition Bill passed the House of Commons on the 11th of November 1920, the anniversary of Armistice Day. The reader is immediately asked to interpret this as, quote, a bitter comment on the sacrifice of 49,000 Irish men who gave their lives for the freedom of small nations in the war. The manner in which the Irish were in her construction denied the rights of national self-determination, a concept central to the discourse of the Versailles peace talks, was further emphasised by her statement that 3/4 of Irish members were absent when the bill passed, and not one of those present voted in favour. Even the Ulster representatives refused to vote, she wrote. This bill for the Government of Ireland, she wrote, was thus made law in spite of the opposition of every Irish representative. Of course, given the landslide victory of Sinn Féin in the 1918 general election, the majority of those elected in Ireland had pledged their allegiance to the First All-Éireann, established on the 21st of January 1919, a fact Macardle fails to state in her desire to accentuate the unrepresentative nature of the vote. By contrast, of course, with the unrepresentative nature of the Government of Ireland Act, the establishment of the First All-Éireann was, she wrote, a national act, quote, as grave as was the Declaration of Independence of the United States to the American people, an act from which the nation could not withdraw, end quote. Macardle's early activism in defence of the Republic coincided with the period of the general election in 1918. I don't have time to go into her previous history, but just very basically, she hadn't been interested in Irish politics throughout her youth. It was only when she came back from Stratford-upon-Avon in 1917 that through the theatre movement and meeting Maud Gonne and Countess Markievicz, she becomes, as she says, a convert to the Republican cause. Her early activism in defence of the Republic coincided with the period of the general election, the establishment of the first Dáil in 1919, and of course the foundation of the Northern Irish State in 1920. She canvassed with Ethna Coyle, Bernard Halligan and Governor Niamh Ruther in Dungannon in the lead up to the April 1918 by-election there. One of her concerns in this period was the position of nationalists in the six-county state established in 1920. Macardle, of course, grew up in Dundalk, close to what would become the border, although, as I said, it must be noted that she displayed no interest in advanced nationalism until 1917-1918. In 1922, she, having rejected the treaty, of course, she began work with Erskine Childers on the publication of An Phoblacht, established in January of that year, for which, amongst other assignments, she travelled to Belfast to report on the Catholic pogroms. In autumn of 1924, she travelled again to Belfast to report on the status of Republican prisoners. By this date, she wrote, the nationalist population of the six-county area were, quote, a defeated minority, feared, detested, and suspected by those in power, end quote. In particular, she wrote, those, quote, who lived near the border were continually visited, interrogated, held up at the point of the revolver and searched. So she's very much presenting the northern state as a frontier-like state, as she put it. Robert Lynch discusses the violence experienced in Belfast between 1920 and 1922, a conflict he describes as, quote, waged against the backdrop of partition and the carnage of the Irish Revolution, end quote. He notes that almost 80% of victims were civilians, by contrast with the rest of Ireland in the period. Macardle reiterates the violence experienced by nationalists in the north in this period in a manner which underscores the propagandist nature of the Irish Republic. Now, I would say that, yes, this was a text that was intended to essentially give credence to De Valera's choices during the treaty and the Civil War, but that's not to say that Macardle's views did not align with De Valera in this context, and she was very willing to break with De Valera in other contexts, or at least to indicate her opposition, particularly in the context of the position of women under the Constitution, and actually also his refusal to enter into the Second World War. So just because it's a work of propaganda, the Irish Republic, doesn't mean that it's not her genuine beliefs. She very much sided with De Valera and his viewpoint in the context of the revolutionary period. So the way in which she describes the violence experienced by nationalists in the north in the period immediately after the establishment of the Northern Irish State very much underscores the propagandist nature of the Irish Republic. She sees herself as a propagandist. She says that the fierce conflict that was waged in the north, as she put it, was described by her in emotive terms designed to point to the manner in which Northern nationalists were at the mercy of Unionists who had brought about partition, as she saw it, by threatening war and landing guns in 1914. There's no similar criticism of the landing of guns by Irish volunteers in Louth in July 1914. In October 1920, such men, Unionists, were, quote, supported by a mob which armed itself with tools, iron bars and paving stones, end quote. Earlier in July 1920, when similar armed mobs, as she described them, attacked the Catholic areas of the city, shooting, looting and wrecking shops, she noted how the military intervened, but only to fire upon members of the IRA who had undertaken to protect property or were standing on guard. So she very much sees the IRA as a defence army, or she presents them as a defence army. Unionist supporters are described as, quote, hate intoxicated, acting out of ruthless savagery. Describing Belfast in March 1922, she wrote that, quote, an intoxicated and bloodthirsty mob were led on by the specials, supplied with bombs, quote, they would rush the narrow streets, howling and looting, burning and murdering as they went, end quote. By contrast, she represents the IRA as adopting, as I said, a defensive position as they aimed in her construction to protect a besieged minority. In fact, as Richard English discusses, there was, quote, no monopoly on northern viciousness, end quote. Atrocities were carried out on both sides of the sectarian divide, a reality elided in the Irish Republic. The Northern Irish elections, held on the 24th of May 1921, resulted in Macardle contended in too many Sinn Féin votes being cast from the Orange men's point of view, and a consequent determination to eliminate the party and its supporters from the Sinn Féin counties, from the 6 counties. The result was, quote, concerted acts of terrorism and violence against Catholics, which began on 8th of June, the day after the first meeting of the Northern Parliament. In Tragedies of Kerry, which she had published in 1924, Macardle repurposed a number of Republican deaths at the hands of the Irish Free State soldiers during the Civil War for propagandist effect, including a home family element that did not exist in newspaper accounts. By describing a violence that focused on the ransacking and defilement of the domestic space and the brutality of forcing women to bear witness to the death of Republican men, Macardle was, in Tragedies of Kerry, concerned to evoke an emotional response in her readers. In describing the violence in Northern Ireland in the period 1920 to 1922 in the Irish Republic, she relied on a similar narrative device intended to highlight the manner in which partition had, as she saw it, devastating consequences for the nationalist minority. She outlines, for example, the double murder in the McGill family home in Corrogues, County Down, carried out by the Ulster Special Constabulary on the 8th of June 1921. Her focus is on the manner in which an elderly man was, quote, kicked and beaten and his daughter threatened, end quote. One of the McGill brothers, Stephen, was killed and another injured. 2 hours later, in her account, the perpetrators returned and took the second son out and left. He was left in a hospital, dying or dead. Macardle relies on the Irish Bulletin, the propagandist Irish Bulletin, and the published sworn statement of the daughter Mary McGee, which was included in the Irish Bulletin, and that was a statement dated the 20th of June 1921, and she includes that statement in her one of the appendices to the Irish Republic. She does not mention any possibility that the McGill brothers were Republican, as the Skibbereen Eagle reported, nor does she refer to the dead and injured on the opposing side. The account in the papers stated that the incident originated in the attempted ambush of a plainclothes cycling patrol during which Constable Gibson was injured. One of the party went to Newry to raise the alarm. By this point, the McGill brothers had retreated towards their home in Corrogues and were surrounded by a large force, including 50 or 60 men from the B Specials. While the house next door to that of the McGills was being searched, Constable Linus was posted as sentry at the head of the laneway. Quote, this is from the Skibbereen Eagle. He had only been there a few minutes when he was shot through the heart, end quote. The Irish Independent the previous day carried an almost identical report of events to that of the Skibbereen Eagle, but noted that Linus was a young man of 25 due to be married in the near future. Such poignant details did not suit Macardle's purpose when they were poignant details relating to the other side. In the Irish Republic, the Northern Nationalist minority are represented as a community who have been subject to attacks and brutality, and even death, as in her account of the McGill brothers. In her narrative, such oppression was the result of the partition state of Ireland. To achieve this heightened sense of a persecuted, blameless minority, she both repurposed and elided certain facts and indeed incidents. And as I said, most notable in this context is the omission of any reference to the Altnavay massacre on the 17th of June 1922 carried out by the IRA. As Robert Lynch details, in a few hours, quote, well over a dozen such assaults, ranging from frenzied gun, bomb and arson attacks to cold-blooded executions, were made on local family homes, end quote. In Macardle's political propaganda, Republican males had certain essentialist qualities that were based on virtues of valour and chivalry. In Tragedies of Kerry, for example, the Irish Free State soldier had become emasculated by his failure to maintain those male virtues. That emasculation was displayed in gratuitous violence, desecration of the domestic sphere, and brutality towards women, of the kind she also detailed in her accounts of the removal of Republican women from Kilmainham jail to the North Dublin Union in April and early May 1923. Yet during the Altnavay massacre, women such as Isabella Heaslip were forced to watch as their husbands and sons were shot. A possible motivation for the attack at Altnavay was the raid on the public house of James McGill, a prominent Sinn Féin councillor, and that raid was carried out on the 14th of June 1922. Failing to find McGill in the house, the specials looted the premises, terrorised his mother-in-law and young children. His wife Umna was raped during the ordeal. A servant girl on the premises was also allegedly subjected to sexual assault. Macardle could not condemn this incident of violence generated by the conflict that accompanied partition because of the brutality of the reprisal by the IRA. In her Civil War jail journal, she had argued that there were limits to Republican violence. For her, men such as Richard Mulcahy were, quote, bestial and grossly insane, end quote. In executing men like Erskine Childers, they were, she wrote, using, quote, a vile weapon. In response, she declared, quote, we can't kill our prisoners. To compete with them, we should have to kill their children. We shall surrender rather than do that, end quote. Yet the violence of the attack on the households and families at Altnavay was of that ilk, as the Belfast Telegraph declared. Quote, in all, 6 persons, including a woman, were done to death, all in the presence of their families, amidst circumstances of the utmost ferocity, end quote. Indeed, the Presbyterian minister who presided over the funerals of the victims stated that even, quote, in war, there is a certain limit to atrocity, a certain code of honour is practised by all, but the vilest savage. In this code, those who wrote Saturday's deed of shame have no share. In later life, Macardle returned to the subject of the Irish border on pertinent occasions. As Europe edged closer to war in 1913, Macardle was in America. She had gone there with Owen McNeill, interestingly, somebody who was on the other side of the treaty divide to her. And she'd gone there as part of a cultural attaché, if you like, to promote Ireland and Irish literature. And she gave a number of lectures. And in the spring of 1939, she found herself in California, in Mills College. And this was a female-only college at that point in 1939. And she gave the commencement address. She was invited to give the commencement address. And her speech was entitled The Common Enemy. And it dealt with issues of poverty, disease, and crime. But there is one section that can be read as an apology for Irish republicanism, as a defence, if you like, of Irish republicanism, as a defence of the revolutionary campaigns against Britain and the anti-treaty stance in the Irish Civil War. She declared, world peace can never be achieved, leaving nations portioned. Sorry, that should be actually partitioned. Leaving nations partitioned, liberty strangled, governments unreversed. No pacifism can be effective that does not seek to remove the causes of war. To deplore the production of armaments is useless while people live in fear. You cannot expect that people will submit unrelentingly to the loss of liberty. As Richard English discusses, the idea of the Irish Revolution promoted by Republicans as a struggle between Ireland and Britain was much more complex than Macardle represented it. It was, he writes, quote, a struggle between Irish people themselves, nationalist versus unionist, Republican versus Home Ruler, pro-treaty versus anti-treaty, IRA versus RIC man. That nuance is obliterated in the Republican propaganda of Macardle, of which the Irish Republic is probably the key example. In 1945, Macardle published, without fanfares, some reflections on the Republic of Éire, a small pamphlet. And it shows the evolution of her political thought. She, of course, had followed De Valera into Fianna Fáil, and while she was very, I won't say upset, because she didn't really get upset, she just got annoyed and irritated. So she was very irritated with how he positioned women in the Constitution. She never fully broke with him. She had sufficient working relationship with him and friendship to actually be able to indicate her disapproval without actually fully breaking with him. So without fanfares, some reflections on the Republic of Era shows the evolution in her political thought as she adhered to De Valera's belief with the establishment of Fianna Fáil that the Republic could be achieved gradually by subversively undermining the 1922 Constitution, working within the parameters of parliamentary politics. In the article, she sketched out the quiet subversive revolution that had changed Ireland's constitutional status from Dominion to Republic, if undeclared Republic. De Valera, she wrote, demonstrated in the Dáil on the 11th of July 1945 that, quote, notwithstanding our external association with the states of the British Commonwealth, the status of an independent republic is Éire's status today. This status, end quote, this status had been achieved, she argued, quote, quietly and surreptitiously. Those are her words. What had been achieved under De Valera, she declared, was the policy of external association. I'm quoting her here. He had advocated this policy, external association, as one of reconciliation, as an attempt to secure a line in which all sections of the Irish nation can stand, each making some sacrifice of its preferences in order to advance as one. Presented in this spirit, the idea has been quietly accepted by the Irish majority, but it calls forth none of the fervent devotion which was given to the pure Republican cause. Reconciliation is not an ideal for which slogans are shouted, bells pealed, and bonfires lit. Macardle contrasted the Republic, quote, of our will and vision, end quote, that was fought for between 1916 and 1923, with what had been achieved by De Valera once he entered parliamentary politics. The former, the Republic that was fought for between 1916 and 1923, she said, quote, struggled unsuccessfully for recognition and a stable place on the international stage, end quote. By contrast, she argued that what had been achieved under a De Valera-led Fianna Fáil was, quote, substantial, a status, a constitution, a freely working democratic state, end quote. Notably, however, she referred to the partition nature of Ireland and argued that the fact that nationalists in Ulster, quote, still suffer from raids, arrest and imprisonment without trial, as we did 25 years ago, precluded a celebration of full independence. Thank you. And quite horrifyingly, I see that I've spelled geography incorrectly on this slideshow throughout the whole thing.
Thanks very much. Yeah, that was an amazing lecture. Suppose we just pick over some points. Just how does she feel after 1945? Then do we know?
Well,
Republic and is she still alive for the Declaration of the Republic? Or?
Oh yes, she is. She doesn't die until 1958. So I think she doesn't really talk at all about the actual declaration of the Republic by Clown Republic, or the Republic of Ireland Act. I think maybe she feels that it steals De Valera's thunder, and I think she has already laid out her claim even before it, like 4 years before it, in this pamphlet Without Fanfares, that he has essentially achieved it anyway. In later life, she would have been involved in very much issues around refugees and for Second World War refugees. She wrote quite an interesting book on children of Europe, which was an account of how the Second World War impacted on displaced children in particular. And of course, she was writing novels in the 1940s, and her last novel was published in 1952.
Okay, it's very interesting. I wonder, just in terms of the Irish Republic and Lloyd George during the opening bit of your lecture, this is a funny question, which I'm now, but why did she think lay all of this at Lloyd George's feet? Is it just because it's a work of propaganda, so she wants to criticize Lloyd George over the treaty, so she wants to, ascribe kind of diabolic qualities to him from earlier in the piece?
Yeah. I think so, but at the same time, as I said, like modern historians do also indicate how wily he was and how he was able to play off both sides. So I think she is very much kind of playing into this idea that the, Irish Republicans at that time were kind of honourable, that they were naive in their honour, in their sense of honour, and of course, she cannot blame De Valera for anything that happens. She just does not want to. So there needs to be kind of an outside, evil kind of Machiavellian figure. So it is a work of propaganda, and you cannot not get away with that. But at the same time, and she won't criticise De Valera at all. And she does criticise Arthur Griffith. Arthur Griffith does come in for a fair amount of criticism by her. He comes across as weak and, essentially somebody who couldn't stand up to Lloyd George. But ultimately, the kind of, anti-hero in the text is Lloyd George.
Yeah, it's just interesting. And does she ever talk about Lloyd George's motivations? Like, does she criticise him for his being kind of anti-Catholic or anti-Irish or anything like that?
I think she definitely feels that, she says on a number of occasions that he had, he was partisan, in favour of the Ulster Unionists. So I suppose you can read that as, partisan against maybe Catholics, if you think about it in sectarian terms. So the interesting thing is Macardle was quite anti-Catholic on a personal level herself in this period. When she enters into the Civil War jail, when she enters into Mountjoy on the 9th of November 1922, she's horrified at the fact that everybody's praying. Mary McSweeney's on hunger strike when she enters, and they're all doing vigils around Mary McSweeney's bed, and she really can't cope at all, and she kind of talks about herself as a heretic in the midst of all these kind of women who are essentially in servitude to the Catholic Church. But of course, given the sectarian divide of Ireland, Northern nationalists tend to be Catholics, so she does interchange Catholics and nationalists in that context.
Okay, yeah, it's very interesting. Do you know anything about just want to kind of back to maybe her political awakening after she leaves Dundalk? Do you know how she felt? I mean, did she travel through Louth at any stage during the campaign? Obviously, as I was saying in the context of another lecture for the symposium, that Louth is one of Sinn Féin's weakest counties in the country. And it's the IPP's best county in the whole country in terms of vote shares. Does she ever travel through Louth at this point? Did she talk about it?
Not that I can get any sense of. Remember, her brother burned her papers when she died. So, I mean, such a travesty. So, sometimes it's hard to piece together exactly where she was. But certainly my sense is that when she went north, she just went to Belfast. And she went to Dungannon as well, then in the context of that election in 1918. But no, she was either based in Dublin. For a while in 1922, she was on the run with Erskine Childress. She was on the staff of Republic. So she was on the run, but it was in the south. They travelled to places like Clonmel, where she met up with De Valera, etc. But no, I don't get any sense that she travelled to Louth at all. I mean, her family would have been very, very important in Dundalk. They owned the Macardle Moor Brewery. Her father was a justice of the peace. He tried to intervene, for example, in hunger strikes in, I think, 1917 to try to encourage the strikers to come off the hunger strike. Her brother, Kenneth, was killed in the First World War. So the family were very much, they had kind of a dual background, if you like. So they were home rulers on the father's side, and they were kind of imperialist on the mother's side. She had no interest in politics at all, really, until she comes back from Stratford upon Avon, where she is in 1916, and she meets Maud Gonne. She's obviously she's a literary teacher of literature, a literary scholar, I suppose you would say, and she meets Maud Gonne and Margaret. She's producing plays in places like the Gate and other small theatres around Dublin. And it's from that point on that she becomes kind of converted, if you like, to republicanism.
Yeah, okay. It's really interesting. And the way, and what do her family think of this then?
Well, in her Civil War diary, her jail journal, she presents the family as completely opposed to her stance. her father tried to get her out of jail on the basis of claiming that he could protect, her. He could essentially tell her what to do when she got out of jail. Now, I got criticized for that by somebody, that person didn't really understand that, of course, that's just a ploy to get her out of jail. But you couldn't use that ploy for a 30-year-old man. You couldn't say, I'll tell that 30-year-old man what to do. But you could, given the gender norms of the period, kind of suggest that, the woman would be, able to be controlled through kind of patriarchal control. So he's agitating for her to be released. She presents it that they completely don't understand. But at the same time, he's known for sending in the best parcels into Kilmainham and Mountjoy. He's the first person to sign in Dundalk the petition to the government for the release of Mary McSweeney. So I think, again, for propaganda purposes, she needs to state that she's so far divorced from this family, which has home rule and imperialistic leanings. So it suits her propaganda's purpose to indicate that there's a huge divide between her and her family, which maybe was not as strong as she suggested it was. They didn't stop talking to her by any means.
Yeah. Okay. It's interesting. And do you think, you note that, people often talk about nationalists of the period ignoring the North. So it's something you see fairly commonly when we're talking through things. We don't have time to go through the ins and outs of it at the moment. But that's clearly not true of Dorothy. So
no,
I think that her origins in Dundalk affected that, or do you know what caused that, or is she just acting under instructions from De Valera?
No, I don't think she's acting under instructions from De Valera. I don't think that's to understand that she's a really strong intellectual character herself, and she didn't take instructions. Yes, her views aligned with his, which is a very different thing to say that she took instructions. Now, before she was tasked with writing the Irish Republic, there was some suggestion that his secretary Kathleen O'Connell would do something similar. Now, she wouldn't have had the intellect to be able to do it, and she also would have been much more submissive to De Valera. I think it's interesting because it's only when you read very closely the Irish Republic that you see that she is repeatedly referring to the North. I think the reality is that the Irish Republic still stands up in terms of its attention to detail, in terms of its very comprehensive treatment of the revolutionary period. So, as I said, it's organised chronologically, chapter by chapter, year by year. So each chapter has a year or even a half a year sometimes. So she does literally go into everything that's happening, including the North. So I don't think it's anything to do with her loud background. It's just she was very intellectually strong, and it is amazing to think that she wasn't a historian by training. She was a literary scholar, and that her job in Alexandra is gone. Alexandra College is gone, of course, because she's in prison during the Civil War, and she has to reinvent herself. And the power of her pen is so strong, and her ability to write is so strong that she does produce this amazing, albeit propagandist text. You can still go back to the Irish Republic and you can still find really important information about dates and who said what and who was where, all the time, of course, understanding that there are certain allegiances, certain things elided. But I think the focus on the North is because it's so comprehensive, and she literally sat down, and it took over 10 years to do this, sat down to, write a detailed, comprehensive account of the revolutionary period.
Yeah, and there are a lot of detail through the periods of 1920 and 21 as well, which probably didn't always survive in later accounts. Later general accounts, they tend to kind of just go. A lot of things tend to skip between late 1920, say, because you have Bloody Sunday, you have big ambushes in 1920, and then they tend to, because there's a multiplicity of small events in 1921. I think people tend to skip over it. One thing actually you mentioned there, and it's just even just a general opinion of yourself as a historian of the period, something that jumps out at me there when you were talking about Dorothy's attitudes to the executions, and just you could talk about this maybe in terms of Dorothy and just generally, if you notice, and it's because it's something I noticed, particularly when you look at the newspapers, the extraordinary. Well, it's in some ways it's natural, but the huge fuss and upset and protest that meets most executions, except maybe when they become a bit more routine towards the end of the Civil War. But right throughout the War of Independence, if people are executed, there's protests outside Mountjoy Jail, and there's everything. and you could read beside, you know, the executions of a certain number of individuals. You could read about the deaths of as many individuals covered in much fewer column inches. And I just wondering, do you have any? There's clearly a big differentiation in the public mind between death by execution and even death in combat, or even for some degrees deaths of bystanders, of innocent bystanders. And I just wonder, do you have any thoughts on that, and what Dorothy would think, and what you think, really?
Well, Dorothy didn't even talk about the 1916 execution because, of course, she wasn't in Ireland, and wasn't interested in politics. But she's in jail when the executions begin during the War of Independence, and she does write in her diary, you know, the horror that comes into the jail, the women's jail, which is Mountjoy at that point, you know, when news of the executions are coming in, and idea of execution as a reprisal. And, you know, it allows her to make a lot of kind of propagandist points about how far the Free State, or the provisional government, later the Free State, have stooped in using this type of a weapon. And she keeps arguing that the Republicans would never do anything similar. Now, of course, when Erskine Childers was executed, that really did cause her serious distress, because they were very close. She had worked very closely with him. She really considered him her mentor. So at the same time as she learns she's lost her job in Alexandra College, she loses her mentor, and it is very distressing. So what's coming into the prison is news of the executions, not news really of any other deaths. So, you know, the jail journal really only talks about, you know, those kind of high profile deaths, death by execution. But you're right. I mean, in any type of propaganda, you're going to focus on certain kind of atrocities, or certain type of, deaths, etc. You know, I think it's really interesting, if you do read the Irish Republic very closely, you know, her focus is always on, you know, the attitude to violence against Northern nationalists, without any talk about, say, the big house burning of, you know, in the context of Southern Unionists. She does elide certain types of violence and certain type of atrocities from her accounts.
Yeah. Okay. And just when we're talking about that kind of elision, do you think, how influential do you think the Irish Republic has been on the historiography? Certainly until, you know, through, like, kind of, it's a pretty open question, which you can kind of give it it's a pretty open answer. It's you know, across the decades, in terms of how much it's been read, both by, you know, popular in the popular realm, and also even, I think, you know, by what you might call kind of informed opinion, you know, as history teachers, people who are, you know, commentators, etc.
Well, I just think of my own growing up. My dad is a historian as well. He has a PhD in history, and he was a secondary school teacher, but, you know, he was really interested in research. So we grew up with loads of books, and I always remember the books were very dingy looking. You know, there were loads of books on the land war, that was kind of stuff. But right up at the top of the bookshelf in the sitting room, there were 2 copies of the Irish Republic. That one that I had there with the kind of green, white, and gold, and I always thought that was just the bizarrest thing. I suppose that it was influential in its day. It certainly was. It was handed out sometimes to visiting dignitaries by De Valera. It's something that is cited by people who applied for pensions, for example, you know, when they want to indicate numbers or something that happened, etc. So for its time, it was very influential. It is kind of interesting if you think about it. In 1937, she publishes her great work, and De Valera publishes, you know, what he saw as his great work, the Constitution. I think it was very influential at the time. It was very propagandist, of course, and it comes, you know, in the context of the history wars, you know, which have been going on since the 1920s. So it's kind of the last, or one of the later kind of examples of those kind of propagandist books. Where I think it's very influential is, I think it's still very, very good in terms of, you know, comprehensive detailing, but you couldn't come at it without actually understanding that it is very partisan and very propagandist. Like, I wouldn't give it to, you know, my 18, 19-year-olds in first year to write an essay on, you know, 1916, because who knows what I will get back.
Yeah.
But I think it certainly launched her. You know, she didn't fail him. And it's not just that she held up, his view of the period, but she did it in a way that was robust in terms of detail, etc. After that, of course, with the revisionist controversy, it's interesting. It's 1 year later, Robert Dudley Edwards and Moody are, talking about a need for more scientific history. So I suppose she would never have been considered an academic historian. She was a propagandist historian. But I know I keep saying this, but I do think it's very detailed in a way that sometimes you don't get in kind of more modern history.
No, yeah, I think that's something that, as I said, reading it for my PhD, I thought that's something that jumped out at me as well. I mean, and it's also quite well written. So there's a
and also one thing that's quite interesting as well is that it does actually deal with women. Now, not hugely, but compared to somebody like P.S. O'Hegarty, who's talking about the women as just coming diehard lunatics. At least she talks about women and men. Without having to take smelling salts, the way you can imagine P.S. O'Hegarty talking about them. So I think it's quite interesting in that context as well. I think it's interesting as well, in the context of Republicans immediately after the Civil War and the disillusionment and the lack of economic opportunities many felt that they had, the need to emigrate, etc. So yeah, I don't know how many people could do something like that in 10 years, today.
Yeah, it's certainly tough. I think as well, but I mean, one kind of bugbear of mine when you go to seminars or things is you often hear the people talk about the traditional view without necessarily saying what it is. I mean, it probably is effectively Dorothy Macardle's view is probably what we would regard as the traditional view of certainly the War of Independence. There might be a recognition that there might be a split afterwards, but it you could argue that is more. It is more or less Dorothy. It's probably you obviously have Beazley as well. O'Hegarty would probably be in a different place, but it certainly is it'd be when we talk about the traditional view, or we talk about say people in the 50s. Expressing a traditional view, it strikes me that a lot of them will have read the Irish Republic,
or certainly dabbled into it, because it's not a quick read by any means.
No,
I was carrying it around my bag for I'd say over a year, and by the end, it had no covers, and it was yeah, no, I'd agree. Dorothy would, and it's interesting. I do think it's interesting that if you Google her name in the military service pension collection, she doesn't apply for a pension. There's only very few actual references to her, but where you see it is the people using the Irish Republican as kind of a touchstone or a Bible, if you like, for what happened.
Yeah, which is interesting in itself. Yeah, and interesting. I'm not sure there's reference to it in the bureau, is there? They do their own chronology.
No. And I wouldn't want to overstate the references now in the MSPC, but it's there certainly. And I just think it's interesting that it's given to visiting dignitaries. De Valera wants to get it published in America, but Macardle won't agree because the publisher that's being promoted or being suggested would have been pro-Israel, and Macardle would have been opposed to that. Interesting kind of a discussion of the whole Israeli-Palestinian conflict at that time. She knew what she wanted, and she was well able to get what she wanted, and I think De Valera was very pleased with it. There's some great photographs of her and him at the launch of it.
I presume extracts were published. Were they published in the Irish press, or?
She got very upset about extracts being published because they were published without proper going back to her, and the ellipses were in the wrong place according to her, which meant that what she wanted to say was maybe not emphasised the way she wanted to say it. No, it wasn't published. It wasn't in the Irish Independent, and even the Irish press didn't publish extracts. I can't remember where published extracts. I won't even come back to me now, but she wrote them a stinking letter to say this is not on.
Oh, yeah. Okay, that's good. And do we know the final maybe question, since we were talking about Dorothy's view of the North, but do we know, was there any kind of outraged reaction in the North to the publication?
No, I mean the reviews were generally speaking either this is wonderful or this is De Valera speaking through Dorothy Macardle. So no, I don't think there was any huge outcry. That would have necessitated people like taking time out to read a large book. No, there wasn't really. I mean, there was some talk of it being a dangerous book. I think Maura Comfort was talking about how, there was some persecution of Republicans, and, being found with the Irish Republic might, cause you to be further persecuted. But I think a lot of that was hyperbole.
Okay, that's interesting. There were all sorts of dark tales. I think it was interesting when you were talking about 1945. I think it was around that point De Valera told the British ambassador that he would have no option but to be a member of the IRA if he lived in Northern Ireland. So I mean, it's probably little surprise that Dorothy keeps the condemnation coming, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean,
what was her attitude to the Second World War actually as well? So since
so she felt that Ireland was sufficiently mature enough to actually be able to enter into the Second World War, and should for moral reasons. She felt that fascism was something that had to be condemned and had to be fought against. So she actually leaves Ireland and she goes to London for the duration of the Second World War, and she puts her pen, if you like, at the service of the BBC. So she writes broadcasts for the BBC. She works with refugees in London. She writes a really interesting novel on the period just before the First World War, about the kind of drift to war. She had been in Geneva in 1933 as part of the Irish press delegation, and she did talk about the kind of drift towards war even in that point, and the kind of horror that was she felt. She talked about the whole kind of bending over to Mussolini's will. So she goes to England for the duration of the First World War. So it's that, and well, there's three issues that she kind of breaks almost with De Valera, and I don't want to say break because they had a real friendship. So they could disagree without actually breaking. But when he decides to take the oath in 1927, she campaigns for the first election in 1927 on the presumption for Fianna Fáil, on the presumption that the oath won't be taken. But of course, it was taken in the context of the second election, and she resigns as director of publicity for Fianna Fáil, but she continues to vote Fianna Fáil, and she of course is horrified by the idea that women's role is in the home in the 1937 constitution. She's not actually, interestingly, as overtly critical in the public domain as some of the other women are. I think she knew De Valera well enough to know that wasn't really going to make him change, but she wrote him some private letters which indicate that she really did not think what he was doing was correct. And then the other issue for her was his stance in the Second World War. But then she's still writing letters to Kathleen O'Connell, asking how the dear chief is. She's writing letters to Edmund Downey, saying that the poor dear chief has a cold. So I think there was a genuine depth of friendship there that never broke.
Okay, that's great. I think we might leave it there. That was you covered so much and gave us so many insights, and it was really interesting. And I found learned loads from it, which wasn't the main point of the exercise, but I'm happy. So, so thanks very much, Leeann.
Okay, thank you, and thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think we all enjoyed that lecture. So thanks very much, everyone, and we'll see you later, hopefully, for some of you, for a lecture from Dr. Peter Rigney, who will be talking to us about trade unions at the time of partition. Thank you.